In a world that moves too fast, we often forget how simple things can still whisper beauty. Here at Teraflora Studio, we slow down to listen, to notice, and to create. Every idea we share begins with something forgotten. An old door, a broken bottle, a weathered root. We see not what they were, but what they can become. Quiet companions to flowers, sunlight, and human hands. This space is where creativity meets stillness. It is not about perfection, but about presence. Every color, every petal, every curve of wood or metal tells a story. One that begins again, even after time has passed. Because gardens, like people, bloom best when they are given a second chance. As you watch, let your mind rest for a while. Let the gentle details unfold slowly. The soft hum of wind, the shimmer of glass, the rhythm of water over stone. You don't need to rush here. This is your pause, your breath, your moment of calm. Disclaimer: the ideas and visuals presented in this video are crafted with the assistance of AI technology, thoughtfully guided by human creativity from Teraflora Studio. Every design, though digitally imagined, is inspired by real textures, seasons, and emotions found in everyday life. If you find peace in these stories, if they spark your imagination, we invite you to subscribe to Teraflora Studio, not just to follow our creations, but to be part of this quiet movement, to see beauty where others see waste, and to let stillness bloom again in your own world. Welcome home to the Garden of Slow Wonder. Welcome to Teraflora Studio. In the quiet corners of a small English garden, beauty often grows not from luxury, but from imagination. The rustic bottle border glow began with a handful of discarded glass bottles, forgotten behind an old farmhouse shed. Their edges were chipped, their colors faded, yet under the late afternoon sun, they still caught a glimmer of life. It was there that an idea bloomed, to give these remnants a new purpose, to let them breathe light again. Each bottle, once a vessel of nothingness, was cleaned, polished, and coated with pastel tones of mint, seafoam, lavender, and soft amber. When placed along the garden path, they reflected the warm rays of the setting sun, scattering them gently across chrysanthemums and asters in bloom. What was once trash now stood as a line of glowing jewels guiding footsteps through a humble sanctuary. Neighbors who passed by would pause. Some smiled in curiosity. Others simply whispered how something so simple could feel so poetic. At dusk, the garden transformed. The bottles glowed faintly as if holding on to the day's last light, echoing memories of seaside cottages and calm autumn evenings. In this space, no perfection was sought. The charm lay in imperfection. The uneven glass, the soft scratches that told stories of years gone by. Each detail added character, each reflection carried warmth. It wasn't about creating grandeur. It was about finding grace in the ordinary. As the night deepened, a soft breeze danced through marigolds, rustling leaves like distant whispers. The path of bottles shimmered softly, marking not just a boundary of soil and flower, but of human creativity and care. Here, the garden didn't need wealth to shine. Only imagination, a bit of paint, and the belief that even forgotten things can glow again. It began with the clang of forgotten metal, old drums left behind after years of work and weather. Most would see rust, dents, and decay. But in the quiet mind of a dreamer, they became something else entirely. The bones of a sanctuary, a refuge where color could bloom again. In a small backyard surrounded by wooden fences, the drums were reborn. Each was cleaned, sanded, and lovingly coated with fresh paint. Soft farmhouse hues that spoke of calm mornings and handmade grace. Cream, olive, and gentle rose covered the steel, transforming what once looked industrial into something tender and alive. Soon, they filled with soil and seeds. Marigolds sprouted first, their fiery petals breaking the dullness of metal. Chrysanthemums followed, spreading layers of gold and blush that softened every edge. Above them, sedum shimmered with quiet strength, thick leaves catching morning dew like glass pearls. Together, They made the air hum with gentle life. Neighbors passing by would stop to admire the transformation. "You made those old drums look beautiful," they'd say. But it wasn't about beauty alone. It was about giving life back to what had lost its purpose. These drums once held noise and work. Now they held silence and bloom. In the evenings, the garden turned golden. Light slipped between the flowers, bouncing off the painted metal and dancing across the fence. It was a reminder that grace often grows from what we choose not to throw away. The drums no longer echoed with emptiness. They sang quietly through color, through life. And as the seasons shifted, the drum planter sanctuary stood firm, humble, strong, and alive. It whispered a message that every gardener understands deep inside. Beauty doesn't always begin with something new. Sometimes it starts with what we dare to keep, to clean, to love again. Some creations begin not with a plan, but with a discovery. A walk through the woods after a storm revealed what nature had quietly sculpted: twisted roots, curved like ribbons, tangled yet graceful. They were the language of time itself, carved by rain, soil, and patience. And from them was born the idea of the whimsical root arches. In a small garden framed by wildflowers, these roots became doorways. Each arch was placed by hand, curved and fitted to create a passage between the ordinary and the magical. Ivy began to creep along the wood, weaving its way through the knots and hollow spaces. Tiny blossoms of white and lavender sprouted near the base, softening every rugged line. As the days passed, the arches changed with the light. Morning mist made them look ancient and mysterious. Evening sunlight turned them golden and alive. Beneath their shade, a carpet of asters and anemones shimmered gently, their petals like whispered secrets of the forest. The garden no longer felt man-made. It felt enchanted, like a forgotten corner of nature rediscovered. Visitors often paused before walking through. Some felt a strange calm, as if crossing into another world. Others touched the wood, tracing the ridges of age, sensing how something once buried in the earth could now stand as art. The roots told stories without words, of storms endured, of persistence, of quiet transformation. And when the wind blew, the arches swayed softly, their vines trembling like laughter. It was in that moment the garden revealed its secret. Beauty isn't always planted. Sometimes, it's found. The whimsical root arches stood not as decoration, but as a reminder that what's once fallen can rise again, and what's once tangled can still bloom in grace. There is a quiet poetry in the sound of water, not the grand roar of a waterfall, but the gentle murmur of something handmade, humble, slow, and alive. That was the heart of the earthen pitcher fountain, born from a few discarded clay jugs once left forgotten behind a farmhouse wall. Their surfaces were rough, their edges chipped, but their shape held memory of hands that molded earth and fire. With a touch of care, they were cleaned, sealed, and stacked to let water flow softly from one mouth to another, like whispers passing through time. The first trickle began hesitant, a shy song in the afternoon air. Then, slowly, the melody grew steady, calm, rhythmic, endless. Around them, the garden responded. Chrysanthemums opened wider under the mist, marigolds gleamed in gold, and even the anemones leaned closer, as if listening. The pitchers, once dry and still, had become a heartbeat for the small patio, a rhythm of renewal. Visitors never hurried here. They lingered. Some watched how the sunlight played through droplets, scattering tiny rainbows on the old terracotta. Others sat in silence, hearing how the flow seemed to wash away noise from the world outside. It was not about luxury. It was about peace, a peace that came from giving an old object a second life. Every evening, as the last light softened, the water glimmered like liquid amber, catching reflections of bamboo and sky. The pitchers stood proudly, their imperfections made beautiful by purpose. In that moment, they weren't mere clay. They were memory, motion, and art. The earthen pitcher fountain teaches something simple yet profound, that beauty often begins where stillness meets care, and that even the quietest things can make the loudest impression if we let them flow again. It started with 3 old doors, each carrying the scars of time, faded paint, chipped handles, and memories of rooms long forgotten. For years, they leaned against a shed wall, silent and still. But one afternoon, under the soft hum of garden birds, someone saw beyond their wear. What if they could open again, not to a house but to beauty itself? And so the pastel door garden wall was born. Each door was sanded smooth, brushed with color as gentle as dawn. Mint green like spring leaves, powder blue like the morning sky, and ivory like quiet clouds. They were arranged side by side, not as barriers, but as a canvas where flowers could climb and spill over with joy. Hanging pots swayed from their frames, overflowing with chrysanthemums and marigolds in gold and coral tones. Sedum and anemones crept up the edges, softening the straight lines with living curves. When sunlight passed through the small glass panes, it painted the garden in shifting hues, a dance between color, shadow, and bloom. Visitors often paused before the wall, unsure if it was art or accident. Yet that was the charm. It looked natural, as if the doors had simply grown there over time. Children called it the wall of colors, while neighbors admired how something so ordinary could look so tenderly alive. At dusk, when the garden lights flickered on, the pastel doors glowed faintly against the twilight sky, reflecting a warmth that no new paint could ever fake. They whispered stories of renewal, of transformation, of the quiet magic that happens when we give the old a chance to become something new. The pastel door garden wall didn't just decorate space, it healed it. It reminded every passerby that beauty doesn't have to begin fresh. Sometimes, it only needs to be remembered. There is something about the rhythm of the sea that stays in the heart. Its motion, its calm, its song. And for one small garden far from the coast, that rhythm was reborn in the curves of bamboo. What began as a few leftover poles from an old project became a bamboo seascape fence, a gentle reminder of the ocean's quiet grace. Each bamboo piece was chosen for its unique bend, some tall, some curved, some slender. They were arranged to flow like soft waves frozen in time, then brushed with colors inspired by the shore. Turquoise for water, ivory for foam, and pale sand for calm mornings. Under the sunlight, the fence shimmered faintly, as though the sea itself had come to visit. Flowers bloomed around it in joyful contrast. Marigolds glowing like coral, asters in violet hues like twilight tide, and anemones swaying as if carried by invisible currents. Together, they formed a scene both tranquil and alive, where color replaced motion but the feeling remained. When the wind blew, the bamboo whispered, a low, soothing sound like a distant shore. It was simple but deeply peaceful. People walking past often stopped, touched the smooth surface and smiled. Some said it made them feel as though they could hear waves even in the middle of the countryside. In the evenings, the fence caught the sunset's last light, turning the garden into a living painting. Each line, each curve, spoke of movement and balance. It was more than decoration, it was poetry built from patience and paint. The bamboo seascape fence became a favorite spot for quiet tea, for reflection, for gentle breath after long days. It stood as proof that serenity doesn't always need distance. Sometimes, it can be built right outside your own door, with a bit of bamboo, a bit of color, and a heart that still listens to the sea. In a world that often seeks perfection, there is a rare kind of beauty in what's imperfectly made by hand. The junkyard pergola charm was never planned on paper. It grew from a collection of forgotten pieces, a few bent metal rods, leftover bamboo, scraps of old paint, and a spark of imagination. The builder saw not junk, but possibility. The structure rose slowly, beam by beam, until a frame stood, uneven yet full of character. Each pole told a different story. One came from an old fence, another from a broken gate, and some had once held up the walls of a shed. Now, together, They formed a sanctuary of shade and bloom. Over time, ivy began to climb its sides. Hanging pots of chrysanthemums and sedum filled the empty spaces with color and life. Bottle lanterns swung gently in the breeze, casting playful glimmers of light across the wooden floor. It wasn't symmetrical, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It breathed warmth and humility, as if the garden itself had built it. Visitors were always drawn to it. Some called it the heart of the backyard. Others said it felt like stepping into a poem. Beneath the pergola, morning coffee tasted slower, and afternoon breezes carried stories through the air. It was the kind of place that made you forget the noise of the world and remember the sound of leaves. The most striking thing wasn't the design, it was the spirit. The junkyard pergola charm reminded everyone who saw it that art can bloom from ruin, and peace can rise from what's been thrown away. The mixture of bamboo, metal, and wood wasn't a clash of materials. It was a harmony of second chances. At dusk, when the lanterns began to glow, the pergola turned golden. The garden shimmered around it, and even the smallest flower seemed proud to bloom beneath its imperfect beauty. In that quiet glow, every broken piece found its home again. It began not with wealth, but with imagination. A pile of discarded wood, a few forgotten window frames, and the quiet dream of a peaceful place to rest. From that modest beginning rose the thrifty gazebo retreat, a little sanctuary built entirely from the generosity of second chances. Each piece carried a history. The doors once guarded old farmhouses. The windows once framed morning sunlight in another life. When joined together, they formed walls that let the breeze wander freely, walls that didn't need perfection, only purpose. The paint was chosen in gentle shades of sage and cream, the kind that whispered calm even before you stepped inside. When the gazebo finally stood, it wasn't grand, but it felt alive. Flowers seemed to find it naturally. Marigolds pressed close to its base, asters climbed along the sides, and sedum framed its entrance like emerald lace. In the afternoons, sunlight spilled through the repurposed glass, scattering gold patterns across the wooden floor. People who visited never called it cheap. They called it honest. There was comfort in its simplicity, a sense that beauty didn't need polish to be felt. Inside, a single wicker chair waited beside a small table, a space for morning tea, soft laughter, and pages of half-read books. The air carried the scent of damp wood and blooming petals, mixing nostalgia with peace. At dusk, bottle lanterns hung from the beams began to glow. The garden turned amber, the air still. In that light, the thrifty gazebo retreat looked timeless, part story, part shelter, part memory. It stood not as a monument to money, but to care, creativity, and quiet living. And for those who built it, it became more than a project. It became a reminder that beauty is never too expensive when it is made with patience, paint, and love. The farmhouse trash revival began with what most people would never look at twice: a pile of rusted metal left to weather behind a barn. For years it sat there, forgotten under dust and rain, until one day, someone saw more than decay. They saw texture, shape, and the soft potential of rebirth. Each piece was cleaned by hand, every edge smoothed, every stain turned into story. Then came color: white for purity, green for hope, terracotta for warmth. Bit by bit, the junkyard pile transformed into something alive. Old buckets became planters. Broken rims turned into curving borders. Bent iron baskets now held cascades of flowers. The result was not a sculpture, but a statement that beauty can rise from what's discarded. Under the open sky, the trash shimmered with its new identity. Around it bloomed chrysanthemums and marigolds, bursting in gold and orange against the pastel-painted steel. Bees hovered lazily above sedum blossoms, and the air smelled faintly of soil and sunshine. Visitors to the farmhouse garden often paused. Some smiled, others gasped. It wasn't about luxury, it was about courage. The courage to see value where others see waste. The metal, once rough and cold, now reflected warmth and purpose. It had become part of the landscape's rhythm, strong, imperfect, and beautiful. When dusk fell, the edges caught the fading light, glowing softly like a memory. The garden no longer felt arranged. It felt grown, as if each piece had chosen to stand there and tell its story. The farmhouse trash revival wasn't just decoration. It was philosophy, a whisper that said, "Nothing is truly useless until we stop believing it can bloom again." And so, with a bit of paint, patience, and imagination, yesterday's scrap became tomorrow's sanctuary, where color meets courage and the forgotten finds its home. Sometimes, space is not the problem, it's imagination. The tiny patio bloom frames were born from a challenge: how to bring life to the smallest of patios, where walls felt too bare and air too still. The answer was simple yet poetic: paint, patience, and the gentle company of flowers. Old doors and window frames were rescued from a renovation pile. Their hinges creaked, their paint flaked, but their shape still held charm. Once cleaned and brushed with new colors, powder blue, olive green, soft ivory, they became frames not for glass, but for growth. Into them went rows of small planters, crafted from cut plastic bottles painted in matching tones. Marigolds danced in one, asters bloomed in another, and sedum trailed softly between them. Together they formed a living gallery, each bloom a brushstroke on nature's quiet canvas. The patio, once plain and narrow, now felt alive, like a secret garden blooming against a wall. When sunlight filtered through in the morning, it caught the bottle's glossy curves and painted the flowers with glimmers of green and gold. At dusk, the colors deepened, and the air filled with the faint scent of earth after watering. It became a space for tea, reflection, or just stillness, the kind of peace only flowers know how to offer. Neighbors often leaned over the fence to ask how it was done. But the real secret was not in the paint or the pattern. It was in the willingness to care for what others might ignore. The tiny patio bloom frames weren't built to impress. They were built to remind. Even the smallest space can become a sanctuary if we fill it with love and light. And when the seasons change, new flowers take the place of old ones. But the frames remain, waiting patiently, ready to hold beauty again and again. It began as an act of quiet defiance, against waste, against dull walls, against the belief that beauty must always be bought. Upcycled plastic bottle fence art was the proof that even the most disposable things could bloom again if only someone cared enough to see them differently. The project started with a pile of used plastic bottles gathered after a neighborhood cleanup. They were washed, trimmed, and cut into petal shapes, each one a small act of transformation. Then came the colors, soft pastels inspired by morning skies and blooming gardens. Mint, lavender, and coral tones breathed new life into what was once lifeless. Piece by piece, the bottles were attached to a plain wooden fence, forming waves, spirals, and blooming clusters. When sunlight hit the garden, the plastic petals shimmered like stained glass, scattering flecks of color across chrysanthemums and marigolds below. It wasn't artificial, it was alive in its own way, catching the light, changing with the day. Visitors often stopped, curious and surprised. They touched the petals, expecting them to feel fragile, but instead found strength in their resilience. The art spoke softly of responsibility, how creation and care could coexist with sustainability. What was once a fence for privacy had become a mural of renewal. In the evenings, small solar lights illuminated the wall, making each translucent flower glow faintly against the night sky. It was magical, but humble, a celebration of imperfection and creativity. Upcycled plastic bottle fence art was never meant to imitate nature. It was meant to honor it. It whispered to every onlooker that beauty doesn't fade when we reuse, it multiplies. In every flicker of light, in every reflection on the plastic petals, the garden told its story. Nothing is too ordinary to shine again. It began as an act of quiet defiance, against waste, against dull walls, against the belief that beauty must always be bought. Upcycled plastic bottle fence art was the proof that even the most disposable things could bloom again if only someone cared enough to see them differently. The project started with a pile of used plastic bottles gathered after a neighborhood cleanup. They were washed, trimmed, and cut into petal shapes, each one a small act of transformation. Then came the colors, soft pastels inspired by morning skies and blooming gardens. Mint, lavender, and coral tones breathed new life into what was once lifeless. Piece by piece, the bottles were attached to a plain wooden fence, forming waves, spirals, and blooming clusters. When sunlight hit the garden, the plastic petals shimmered like stained glass, scattering flecks of color across chrysanthemums and marigolds below. It wasn't artificial, it was alive in its own way, catching the light, changing with the day. Visitors often stopped, curious and surprised. They touched the petals, expecting them to feel fragile, but instead found strength in their resilience. The art spoke softly of responsibility, how creation and care could coexist with sustainability. What was once a fence for privacy had become a mural of renewal. In the evenings, small solar lights illuminated the wall, making each translucent flower glow faintly against the night sky. It was magical, but humble, a celebration of imperfection and creativity. Upcycled plastic bottle fence art was never meant to imitate nature. It was meant to honor it. It whispered to every onlooker that beauty doesn't fade when we reuse, it multiplies. In every flicker of light, in every reflection on the plastic petals, the garden told its story. Nothing is too ordinary to shine again. There is something ancient in the way roots move, how they twist, reach, and hold the earth together. The root and rope pergola was born from that same instinct, built not with symmetry or precision, but with the rhythm of nature itself. It began with a collection of driftwood and roots gathered after a storm. Each piece was shaped by water and time, each curve carrying a memory of soil and rain. Rather than cutting them straight, they were left raw and wild, bound together with thick jute ropes that echoed the strength of vines in the forest. As the structure rose, it felt less like construction and more like choreography. The roots intertwined naturally, the ropes wrapped around them in rough elegance. When finished, the pergola didn't look new. It looked alive, as if it had grown there overnight. Beneath it, a path of smooth stones led through beds of marigolds and sedum. Ivy climbed the ropes, softening their coarse texture with green. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the gaps, tracing patterns of light and shadow that changed with each passing hour. It was both shelter and sculpture, both wild and tender. Visitors often stood quietly beneath it, feeling the coolness of shade mixed with the scent of wood and earth. Some said it felt like standing inside an old tree's heart. And maybe that was true. The pergola wasn't built to dominate the garden, but to become part of it. At dusk, when the air turned golden, the ropes glowed faintly against the weathered roots. The garden seemed to breathe slower, the flowers resting, the world at ease. The root and rope pergola was not an object. It was a story, a collaboration between human hands and the memory of trees. It reminds us that elegance doesn't always need perfection. Sometimes, it only needs honesty. In every knot of rope and every curve of root, there's proof that beauty and strength are born from the same soil. Sometimes a garden doesn't need walls. It only needs rhythm. The drum and barrel patio divider was created from that simple idea, a way to separate spaces without closing them, to bring color instead of concrete, and to turn the ordinary into something quietly extraordinary. It began with a collection of discarded drums and wooden barrels, once used for oil, grains, and water. Each was cleaned, cut, and given a second life through color. Sage for calm, cream for light, and pale blue for air. When placed together, they formed a soft curve that wrapped around a small patio like a gentle embrace. Into each vessel went soil and hope. Marigolds burst in golden clusters, sedum crept between edges, and chrysanthemums stood tall in rust-red hues. Over time, the line of drums became a living wall, shifting, blooming and breathing with the seasons. It didn't block the view, it framed it. Visitors often paused, tracing fingers along the painted metal, admiring how something once industrial could look so tender. The divider created both privacy and openness, letting air and fragrance flow freely. It was practical, but it felt poetic, a meeting of function and grace. In the evening, as the light softened, the barrels glowed faintly under the touch of sunset. Their shadows stretched long across the patio, blending with the flowers they held. The sound of bees lingered, and the air tasted of paint, petals, and peace. The drum and barrel patio divider became more than decor. It became a story about boundaries that don't divide, but connect. A reminder that separation doesn't have to mean isolation. It can mean rhythm, harmony, and breath. And in that small space between garden and home, color and calm found each other again. Somewhere between the land and the sea lies a kind of peace that can't be built. It must be felt. The seaside bottle pergola was born from that feeling, an attempt to capture sunlight, breeze, and memory within the quiet frame of a garden. It began with a handful of old glass bottles gathered from a coastal thrift shop. Some blue as the deep ocean, others green as seaweed, and a few clear as morning mist. Instead of discarding them, their new owner imagined them not as waste, but as windows for light. And so the pergola took shape. The beams, made from reclaimed wood and driftwood, were drilled carefully to hold each bottle snugly. When the sun rose, light poured through the colored glass, scattering gentle ripples of color across the floor. It looked like water, still, luminous, endlessly changing. Beneath the pergola, marigolds and asters swayed softly in the salty air. The breeze carried the faint hum of distant waves and the scent of flowers. Sitting there felt like listening to silence sing, a harmony of glass, wind, and time. Neighbors called it the glowing roof. Children stood underneath, letting the colored light fall across their faces. It was simple, yet full of wonder, proof that nature and craft could dance together without effort. At sunset, when the bottles caught the last fire of the day, the pergola turned golden, then indigo, then soft blue again. It was as if the sea had come to rest above the garden, refusing to leave. The seaside bottle pergola wasn't just a structure. It was a dream made tangible, fragile, bright, and deeply human. And when night arrived, with the hum of crickets and the scent of cool earth, the pergola remained aglow in memory. A quiet promise that even discarded glass can hold the light of the world, if only we let it shine again. Some spaces aren't designed, they're remembered. The vintage door bloom nook was born from nostalgia, from the quiet wish to sit among things that once held stories. It began with a few antique doors rescued from an old farmhouse, their paint cracked, their knobs rusted, their hinges whispering the past. Rather than discarding them, they were stood upright, side by side, forming a curved wall like a gentle embrace. A soft coat of color revived them, sage, cream, and blue like faded sky. Between the panels, small pots of chrysanthemums and ivy were hung, trailing softly over time. Flowers filled every gap the years had left behind. Inside the nook, a single bench awaited, a place to rest, to read, to simply be. The air was always calm here. Even the breeze seemed to slow down. Sunlight streamed through the glass panes, fractured by age and texture, scattering golden flecks across the marigolds. Felt like sitting inside a memory. Visitors said it looked like something from another time, yet strangely familiar. Children peeked through the door windows, laughing. Elders smiled quietly, recognizing echoes of their own childhood homes. The nook held not just flowers, but feelings, melancholy, warmth, the poetry of time well lived. As the day turned to evening, the old doors caught the sunset like mirrors of nostalgia. Their worn surfaces glowed faintly, their shadows long and kind. The garden hummed with crickets, the flowers leaned into the light, and everything seemed to breathe together. The vintage door bloom nook became more than a garden feature. It became a sanctuary for reflection, a gentle reminder that age doesn't fade beauty, it deepens it. Every chipped edge, every faded color, was proof of endurance. The doors no longer opened to rooms, they opened to peace. And in the quiet of twilight, surrounded by blooms and echoes, the nook whispered softly, "Beauty never really leaves. It just changes form, waiting for someone to open the door again." And so, another story of renewal comes to rest. What began as fragments, bottles, roots, wood, and color, has now become a quiet garden of meaning. Each idea, each creation, carries a small reminder that beauty does not fade when things grow old. It simply changes its form. Here, at Teraflora Studio, we believe that every forgotten object holds a memory waiting to breathe again. Every garden corner, every brush of paint, every hand that dares to care, creates not just decoration, but devotion. It is in these small, honest acts that we find something greater than art. We find connection. As you step away from this story, may your eyes linger a little longer on the ordinary things around you. An empty jar, a piece of driftwood, a patch of dry soil. They are not endings, but beginnings, waiting for your touch. In them, you might hear the same quiet voice that guides us. A whisper to slow down, to notice, to nurture. Here, creativity is not noise. It's a form of peace. A way to bring color back to silence. A way to make time feel gentle again. If this moment has brought you calm or sparked your imagination, we invite you to subscribe to Teraflora Studio, not for the sake of numbers, but to grow together slowly, beautifully, one idea at a time. Let your heart rest in stillness. Let your hands remember kindness, and may your world bloom softly, just as this one does. Thank you for being here with Teraflora Studio, where beauty begins again.